Hi, BookTube. Today I'm going to talk about tonight rather, I'm going to talk about my favorite authors. And the I have only and the authors on this list are authors whom I've read three or more separate works. So if you've read an entire a five or six book fantasy series, for example, but didn't read any of that author's other separate works, that doesn't count. So it's not that I've read three books by each of these authors, it's that I've read three separate self-contained works. The exception to this rule is the shared universe concept, that you can read a standalone book that you don't need to read other books in a series, like a sequel, for instance, for fuller context of the bigger picture. All of these books can be all of the books can all of the series or individual standalones can be appreciated, can be read on their own. So you might which I will get to, by the way, in this later with one of these authors. My favorite book of all time, the author of my favorite book of all time, is not on this list because I've only read one of his works. These are the authors that I keep coming back to because of their consistent skill in writing a good story. And one disclaimer. I don't buy books based on author. At least, usually not. Usually not. It might have the name of an author might grab my attention, but if the story within it, if the synopsis doesn't interest me, I'm not going to read that book just by virtue of the author. I know some people will on BookTube will do that. I don't buy books based on author because I'm not really excited about their prose or their storytelling skills. What attracts me to specific authors is if they consistently tell good stories, or consistently write good nonfiction books. It's not the prose, it's not the style of writing that gets me excited, that's saying, ooh, it's that author, I gotta read that book. No, I want to know what the book is about first before I buy a book by any author. So, with that criteria out of the way, here are my favorite authors. The authors I keep coming back to for most of their separate works. So we have Robert Harris. This is Fatherland, a classic alternate history. Robert Harris writes consistently well in terms of writing historical fiction, sci-fi, and alternate history. He is a master. His specialty is usually historical fiction. So I've read Fatherland, I've read The Second Sleep, and I've read Archangel. But yeah, his specialty is historical fiction. He really writes interesting stories. His prose is not exciting. None of these authors are. But yeah, he consistently writes good historical fiction, and a little bit of dabbling in other things, sci-fi, alternate history. On a similar note, Stephen King. I've read. This is the Dutch edition of The Long Walk. I want to read this one, but I would be reading it at a snail's pace, and then I cannot participate in BookTube for like well over a year, because I'd be reading this very slow. But I want to read it because I really want to learn Dutch. So Stephen King, I've read Needful Things, I've read Rose Madder, and I've recently finished Pet Sematary. So, yeah, Stephen King. And it's just by coincidence that I have a large collection of Stephen King books. They all came to me randomly. People bought some of those books from me, even though I didn't ask for them. I inherited them from my parents. Um, Only two of them I bought, and one of the two that I bought I haven't read yet. It's the reason I've read 3 or more Stephen King novels. Now, Stephen King has what is called a shared universe. Some of his books, like the Dark Tower series, are a series, and some of his books have sequels, like the Talisman has Black House, for example. Um, so some of his books you have to read more than one book to get the bigger picture. But most of his books are standalone books. They are in a shared universe, but you don't need to read another Stephen King book to appreciate the story within one of those standalone books. But I don't go out of my way to look for Stephen King. It's just that he's all over the place. Like, he's easy to find. I inherited several books. So it's a strange coincidence that I read a lot of Stephen King books. The reason I read Pet Sematary specifically is because I wanted to read more horror, and so I can have something to talk about in Horror BookTube. That's why I read Pet Sematary. Although I wanted to read another horror novel that I lost. I talk about that in another one of my videos, Books I Lost. Anyway, so yeah, Stephen King. He writes horror, and he writes consistently good horror. He writes consistently good horror novels. Although he does expand to fantasy and sci-fi. So it's not just horror that he writes. But yeah, like I said, the main reason I read a lot of Stephen King is because he's all over the place. And there are lots of hits and misses. But I don't go out of my way looking for him. Finally, Robert Ludlum. I recently bought this book in Tokopedia after I finished my Read What You Bookmark challenge. I'm right now on chapter 5. Robert Ludlum is my guilty pleasure author. He writes most of his stories with a little bit of variation are usually the same formula. Evil secret organization bent on world domination, and our hero has to stop him. That's a consistent cookie cutter formula, just like James Bond novels. He writes consistently the same themes in his political and espionage thrillers. Now, it's very formulaic, it's very cookie cutter, but it works. I have a good time. I'm in for a hell of a fun ride. Not all of them. Some of them I didn't like. I wasn't a huge fan of Trevayne, for example. But yeah, I've read Robert Ludlum novels. I've read, 4 of his novels, and this is the 5th. So, let's see. I've read The Apocalypse Watch, The Bancroft Strategy. Review on this channel, by the way, of that one. Trevayne, also review. And the Scarlatti Inheritance. Those are the 4. This is the Matarese Countdown. It's actually a sequel to the Matarese Circle. This one was published in 1997. In a future review of this book coming up. Stay tuned. So, let me know in the comments who are your favorite authors based on my criteria. Have you read 3 or more of their separate standalone works? And tell me if you get excited when you see an author's name attached to a book. The power of celebrity in an author's name. let me know. I'd be interested. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.